we're planning to start at 10 o'clock. It's a little bit after 10, so hopefully we have everybody here who plans to attend. The purpose for this meeting is, and sort of a follow-up on discussions we've been having over the last year or so about different methods in funding a water tank. We had been working with Harriman City on that. Harriman was not successful in finding any methods, and the reason we've been working with Harriman is that we have an agreement with them to operate our system, and so we were hoping we could use some of their resources. But it still is an issue of borrowing money. And so going with Salt Lake County, they said they were willing to go through the process with us. So over the last year, we've been working on just some different scenarios on how the county can fund it. They're setting up a special assessment district and bonding for it. The county does have the ability to do that. So that's what is sort of the root of what everybody has received on this. Now, this is the first meeting with the county. There'll be a lot of questions about different scenarios. There is some give and take on this. We need, or the county needs to get some indication, do we want to move forward on a special assessment district? Is this the way we want to do it? If we don't want to, then it'll end here. If there's some strong support for doing it, or looking into it further, then we'll move on to some other meetings. So with that, we have Patrick Leary here, who is the county township manager, who's handling this project for the county. And then we have Jonathan Ward, who's Zions Bank, who's going to get into some of the nitty-gritty on the financing. Go with that, Patrick.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. There's nothing like receiving a letter from your local government letting you know that for the next 20 years, if you want to do this, you're going to owe us $10,000 or $20,000 or $5,000 per year, right? To get your attention. So, very first thing, if you've got your assessment letter here, go to your page 4, where it says what we said unintentionally would be your annual assessment that this went forward. Take out your big red magic marker, cross off the word annual, and note the number there is the assessment on your property if you choose to move forward, your total assessment. Total assessment, not your annual assessment. So hopefully you all recognize that we really screwed up when we used the word annual there, because you're smart people, but we apologize for any shortness of breath or heart attack you may have had when you saw that number. So, as Arlene mentioned, your homeowners association came to Salt Lake County and asked for our help. Our role in this is simply to be a possible mechanism for you if, in fact, you want to move forward with a new water tank. Nothing else. We're here to help. We have a means to help you, but the decision is yours as a community. Nothing more, nothing less. So, without further ado, let's have Jonathan Ward from Zion's Public Finance come up. He's going to walk you through the methodology and the rationale, the calculations. And remember, as Arlene said, there is some give and take in this area, but what he's going to walk you through is what your homeowners leadership in Zion's Bank came up with, okay? And then we'll open it up for questions.
If we need to, I'll leave the microphone here on the table and I'll step over here so I can run the computer and adjust slides as needed. But as Patrick indicated, my name is Jonathan Ward. I'm with Zions Bank Public Finance. Our role across the state is to work with local governments when it comes to financing needs, looking at the tools, the methods, the costs, etc., for financing public infrastructure for local governments. You, as a homeowners association, are not a local government. There's a big distinction there. So our function would be non-existent if we were trying to help you directly, but because Zions Bank Public Finance is contracted with Salt Lake County as its financial advisor, we're acting in that capacity. I'm not specifically the banker assigned to Salt Lake County, but my partner's out of town this morning and asked me to cover. I work as the financial advisor to Harriman City. The same methodology that is being used by the county could be used by the city and has been used by the city in years past for this type of project. However, because the High Country Estates 2 is not within the corporate boundaries of Harriman City, they cannot be the sponsor, if you will, to help finance the project. Salt Lake County has to be that sponsor. And we're grateful to them for being willing to help out. As Patrick indicated, this is something they're willing to do if you want. It isn't something that's intended to be forced on you. So the process will allow your voices to be heard and will allow you to share with the county what you think about the project, about methodologies, about the assessments, about the whole process. That will be weighed in the balance, if you will, by the county council if they decide to move forward. I'm going to set this down here, and I'll talk a little about, first of all, assessment areas or assessment districts. It used to be called special improvement districts. A couple of years ago, the state legislature changed it to special assessment areas. So I'll call them assessment areas or SAAs. Sometimes we call them SIDs, special assessment districts. They all mean the same thing, but if I'm confusing you, raise your hand and stop me.
Would you like somebody to be live for it?
If you want to do that, that would be very helpful. So,
Just tell me when.
right now, there you go. Special assessment areas were originally created to fund infrastructure in parts of our communities that hadn't been developed. In particular, curb, gutter, sidewalks in some of our older parts of town, the historic parts of downtown communities that needed to be rebuilt, if you will. The curb, gutter, and sidewalk were sort of the natural improvements at the time. Street lighting, some drainage. Sometimes we have storm drain issues in older parts of and historic parts of our communities because there is no place for the water to run. These types of areas have evolved over the years to include infrastructure improvements, public infrastructure improvements that would be put into developing areas, or in some cases raw ground. For instance, Harriman, large sections of Harriman are just raw farmland right now with no water, sewer, or other type of infrastructure. The use of these types of tools, financing tools, in areas that are just dirt, have engendered the name of dirt bonds, because you're developing dirt, putting in public infrastructure. Thanks. Next slide. The process generally begins, well not generally, the process does begin with an intent resolution approved by the governing body, in this case the Salt Lake County Council. The intent resolution calls for a protest hearing. This is where the public's voice gets heard. Those who live within the jurisdiction that is to become this special assessment area have the opportunity to voice their concerns. They have the opportunity to voice their questions. And the first part, or the first opportunity to do so, is in this protest hearing. The intent resolution sets the date, and it tells all the residents who live within the special assessment area when you can come voice your comments, or how you can voice your comments. It doesn't have to be in person, it can also be in writing. That intent resolution describes the boundaries and the types of improvements. In this case, it's discussed that we're going to put in a water tank on behalf of the homeowners association. If there's sewer lines that need to be put in, you can do that as well. If you wanted to put in other public infrastructure, you can do that as well through a special assessment area. It describes the cost of such improvements and the methodology used to allocate those costs. And lastly, an estimated assessment for property. The letter that each of you received is very, very similar to a notice that you would receive should the county proceed that would outline, here's what we're improving, here's the cost of the improvement, here's how it's going to be allocated. So that letter that you've seen here, very, very similar. After the intent resolution's been approved by the governing body, the public hearings held. Under current state statute, and this is changing, but under current state statute, if 50% of those assessed, or I should say 50% of the assessment protest, either verbally or in writing, then the governing body cannot create the assessment area. Now, this is a little different than a bond election or other sort of elections where 50% of those who vote have to vote affirmatively. This is a negative vote. If you don't want it, you vote. And it's 50% of the assessment, which is critical. So if one property owner bears 51% of the total assessment, they have 51% of the say. If your assessment's larger than your neighbor's, you have more say in whether this proceeds or doesn't proceed. So it's not one vote per person, one vote per property owner per se. It's one vote per assessment. If you've got a larger assessment, you've got a larger vote. So that's critical to know in this case. Generally speaking, a county council or governing body will evaluate how many protests there are. Although it's 50% right now, to stop the process, the legislature is considering a 35% threshold, more than 35% protest, and that would stop the process. Generally speaking, the governing body, as they go through this process, would stop if they sense really any sort of resistance. Not necessarily 5% or 10% or 20%, but there's a willingness on the part of the governing body to move forward if they think the vast majority want to do so. There's a question in the back.
You said 30%, that number has changed currently?
It may. This last legislative session, there was discussion about it. It didn't have enough support in the legislature to move forward, but they're going to talk about it next year as well. Yeah, so there's ongoing discussions about what that threshold should be. Great question. He asked if you didn't hear. 35%, when is that going to take place now? Yes, ma'am?
So that wouldn't have any effect on us, though?
Not at this point, correct. If you move forward right now, the 50% threshold is in play.
Does that correlate to like the Tracy's used to with their assessment? A non-voting, how does that correlate to the special assessment?
She's asking how does this correlate to the High Country Estates Phase 2? And I don't know. I don't know if anyone else knows. That does not relate because it's a different issue, it said. But I'm not certain. The statute as it's written right now, after the hearing, allows for an additional 60 days for property owners to think about what it's going to cost, to think about what it means to them, think about the improvements, and within that 60 days, after the public hearing, property owners can also protest and let their voice be heard. Okay, so there's a couple of options, a couple of opportunities. First at the public hearing, leading up to the public hearing. After the public hearing, there's another 60-day window. Questions here and here.
Yeah, we don't live in High Country Estates right now. We own property. And so today's the first time that we learned that it's not an annual assessment, it's a total assessment. There's lots of people who own property and live out of state who probably won't be here. Has somebody corrected that for them? Because I'd have voted totally wrong.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we talked about when the notices were sent out and comments started flowing in. Hey, wait, this is my annual assessment. That's quite a lot for a water system. We will send out, I think that's the plan, send out a new notice that will look like this, correcting that issue as well as any other corrections. In addition, the actual legal notice would have that correct as well. Excellent question. And because there are many property owners who don't live within the homeowners association, live here, live out of state, live out of town, they do have a say. We'll get information to them the best we can. It's important to realize too that we're going to be using data that's on the Salt Lake County records. Sometimes we've created these assessment areas in other parts of the state. Property owners live in California, but the county has Salt Lake City address for some reason. They have long since moved. Well, we don't know that. We only have what records we have. So if you're aware of others who don't live around and maybe have a wrong address, we ought to make sure it's corrected. Yes, sir, and then yes, sir.
Question on this dirt bond is if you have a house or rock, ground, dirt, what is the balance? Not the valuation of the property, but the actual land area is the degree of vote that you get. Is that correct?
We'll talk about that shortly, about the assessment methodology and how that's allocated between homes that are there versus raw ground. If that's all right, can we hold that? Thank you. Yes, sir, and yes, sir.
It seems that the structure that you put in place here is flawed in that the bulk of the future benefits are going to go to the landowners, the large landowners who don't have a house on it. Now, they're currently assessed lower because they don't have a home on the property. But the bulk of the current costs go to those that don't have a big future benefit. Those that have a home and a smaller acreage. And also, it's also flawed in the way we protest, and that is the people without the big future benefit have more leverage because they have more current assessment now because they have a single home and a small lot. They won't have a big future benefit, but they have more leverage because of their current assessment. And the people who have a greater future benefit don't incur much current costs, but have a bigger future benefit, and they don't have much leverage to protest because of their smaller assessment. That seems to me a flaw.
Seems backwards.
It's
Well,
not
that's why we're having the meeting. I think that's it's a very valid comment and something we'll want to talk about as we adjust the assessment allocation. That's a very good comment. Yes, sir.
So is this considered a public hearing?
No, this is not the public hearing. This is an informational meeting only to see whether we want to proceed with the intent resolution in public hearing. Great question. Back and then here. Yes, ma'am.
Are you going to put another level so we can get the comments from the
We'll show you the formula. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
some people probably already sent this letter back saying, oh, I don't want to participate because I'm not seeing that here. Are they going to have the opportunity to change that?
So this is basically
Say that again, sir.
So this is basically garbage, and we'll get a new one, that will be more.
That background information is really helpful.
So, to your comment, sir, that piece of paper should be used for information for you. Take that number, because that number likely won't change unless the assessment methodology changes. Divide it by 20, and you'll see what the annual cost would be to you. So it's good information. As Jonathan said, we will correct the letter, and if there's anything else that needs to be corrected in it, we will resend the letter. To the gentleman's point about is this the public meeting, the public hearing? Excuse me. This is not. We're here today to provide information only to you. And Salt Lake County's interest in this is to move forward only if you want us to. We have no other interest beyond that. Yes, sir.
I think the point of her question was that you sent out, or his point was that you sent out that survey to get a feel for the support that you'd receive, but because of the flaw in the letter, are you going to take that survey as being a valid result, or are you just going to say, let's try it again?
No, we're going to send out a corrected letter and just let everyone know, including those who don't live in town, have the they have accurate information to make their decision on. So to those people who have already sent in the letter, you'll receive another one. If you said no and you're now more interested, or if you said yes and now you don't want to, you'll be able to change that. Yes, sir.
How is a non-vote assessed?
Are you talking in his world or in this world?
In this world?
A non-vote is a yes when it comes to assessment areas.
So I think it'd be useful for Jonathan to move on. Go ahead, sir.
So that seems like, so a non-vote is a yes, which is asking for a higher assessment on our taxes. That doesn't seem right. Yeah, that's outrageous. A non-vote in almost all systems across the world is no. That's not right.
Well, I think you can see some of the challenges with creating a special assessment district. I think the things you're pointing out here are what are in existing law. So we're not, this is nothing we're making up. This is what's in existing law, and that's the rules we have to play by. So if you don't like it, you get to make a choice on how you want to proceed. Yes, sir.
You know, there's an issue that Liberty had, and the neighbor forced into their special assessment.
That's possible that we can one day
I wasn't directly involved in that, but my partner who works with Salt Lake County was, and it's the exact same situation. They had an assessment area to put in some water system improvements for fire flow, fire protection issues. They tried to allocate the assessment equitably amongst all property owners. There were those who wanted it and were in support. There were those who did not speak out, and therefore the protests did not come in. The county continued. They sold the debt. They put in the improvements, and everybody was assessed. It was the same mechanism, and to your point, sir, I don't disagree. This is backwards from the way we've generally done it, which is why I made the point. It is not an affirmative vote, yes, I want it. It's a negative vote, no, I don't, which is backwards. No question, but that is, as Patrick indicated, the way the law is currently set up. Yes, sir.
To me, this seems like a Trojan horse. I mean, what did we get when we sold our water? And I know this isn't a question to you, but it seems to me that your presence here is premature. Shouldn't we look at what is it we're going to get for the money before we talk about the money? And then also, as far as what we're going to get, why is it costing us more than 10 times as much for a tank this time as our previous 2 tanks? And also, what did we get when we sold our water right to Harriman? My understanding was they were going to then be responsible for the further development of this system. So it seems everything is structured here for developers, and it's not structured here custom fit for this community. This community is a community that's bootstrapped itself, bootstrapped its own development, and this is custom fit to put a financial burden on us so that we sell out to developers, and then it's more streamlined for what the county and what the bankers like.
Could be, and that's why we're having the information now. We want to give you all of the information so that you're aware and can make the decision on your own. Again, I think this is really your decision. But let's see if we've got a couple of questions. We may address them as we proceed through the presentation, but let's hear what you have.
I just want to straightforward on what he said. I agree that Harriman City has the water rights now. Harriman City is billing each one of us by the month. If we pay for what they're staying, Harriman City is still making profit for whatever they get off of that water. Are they assessing this as well?
No, Harriman City is not. No governmental entity can be. That's the law.
They need to be able to, I mean, they're billing.
Okay.
But didn't it say in the letter that they're already going to take the dividends that is profit of the water? The bills is one thing already, it's already in the process after construction.
Yeah, that's how I understood too. Like in the letter, it seems like the Area A tank is already paid for, just hasn't been done.
And starting.
Okay, since everybody else is speaking now and I raise my hand, my question is, can we please move forward where a lot of these questions are going to be answered, and then have the discussion afterwards, because that's what the agenda was, and I think that will actually help everybody get their questions answered. Please move forward.
I'd like to second your comment.
Let me really quick explain the water right issue, because I think there's some confusion on that. We had an agreement at one time for Harriman to buy all of our water rights. We had remember when Leilani Bigaka and some others filed a lawsuit against us to block that. As a compromise, we sold only the water rights that were clearly never reused by anyone. We had more water rights than what we needed. So we sold that to Harriman. The remaining water rights are being leased to Harriman right now. When somebody develops, Harriman normally requires them to give one share of water to the city. That one share, then, our country will provide for that person who develops. So the remaining water rights are for the people who haven't developed yet. They'll get the bottom line is they get $2,000 off their water connection fee. So, and that's kind of a side issue to this. The bottom line is we do need the money to fund this thing.
There were 7 items on the master plan.
Pardon?
There were 7 items on the master plan from the engineering company that did that. The plan.
Yes.
And there's only 2 of them that have been addressed. One is the main area A. This one we're talking about. Pay for the others. I was wondering if we thought about just doing the whole thing. This is great, we're going to fund it. Just get the whole thing so that when we sign up for that special assessment agreement, we're signing up all 4 areas. Everybody who's in all those areas with the whole wall around. We'd like to see that something in area B does not have to be contributed by A, B, or C.
We could do that, and I'll sort of give my answer, and I'll let the finance people correct it, because this is my understanding of it. The water master plan, had a figure for the whole build out of the water system, and it was somewhere between $5 and $6 million. I don't remember the exact figure. And there were several components on it. And one of the components was this tank. The original estimate for this tank was close to $2 million. Once we got the engineer involved and the construction drawings and all the detail has been done, the cost went up. And with inflation, the cost has gone up. Now that's 3 years old. And then there's finance costs on top of it. That's how it came to be $3.3 million. If we looked at the entire system, and there's components that we don't need right now today because of the source protection area, we don't know when those people will be off the source protection area. So if we did fund that, the whole build out of the water system for that area, and people couldn't use it, 20 years goes by, we have the infrastructure we're not using. I don't know if that can be funded. I know we had that discussion with Science Bank originally. And then there's other components like replacing water lines, things like that. Right now, we're working with Harriman to kind of nickel and dime some of that stuff through water rates. If we have to replace something, we replace it with something to code. That's a very slow process. 20 years from now, I don't know how much of that will have been done. But anyway, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that whole step-by-step process, but I think the bottom line is there are components that we wouldn't be using right now, and we don't know when we'll be using.
No, good questions. Again, assessment areas, it's a tool to help accomplish some of these needs, and these are great questions. After a public hearing, this is again the legal step. This is not our informational sessions here, but part of the legal process says that after we've done the 60-day protest period, the governing body would approve a designation resolution that would establish an assessment area, designate an assessment area. construction bids will be opened, and on the next slide, thanks for helping out again. After construction's done, or perhaps even before construction's done, the governing body will appoint a board of equalization. This board of equalization will sit for 3 consecutive days for at least 1 hour and hear everybody's thoughts, everyone's comments. This board of equalization would have a list of all of the assessments for every property owner, and that assessment list would be deemed the semi-final assessment list. Property owners would come into the Board of Equalization and say, I don't like this assessment, this amount, the rationale, methodology, because my property's not buildable. I was overcharged because my acreage was wrong. Whatever the case may be, for whatever reason, the Board of Equalization hears comments from the public again and has the right to recommend to the council, the governing body. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different. A change in the assessments for individuals. It's not expected that they would, during this Board of Equalization hearing, change everybody's assessment, but it would be an individual adjustment. It might be a little bit less. I don't see anyone coming in to protest that they should be paying more. It's usually less. But the Board of Equalization would make those changes if they so choose. Any changes made at that point would come at a cost to the governing body. Meaning if they think the total cost is $3.3 million after construction said and done, they've allocated everybody's assessment out, and one person says, I don't want a $10,000 assessment, I think I should be charged $5,000. There is no way, realistically, practically, to charge that $5,000 to somebody else without going through the whole process again, and noticing and going through another Board of Equalization. So if they choose to drop someone's assessment by $5,000, that's a cost that would be borne by the governing body of Salt Lake County. So they may or may not do that. We've had a number of these assessment areas in the Board of Equalization where property owners protest, city council or the county commission or county council said, okay, we'll make those changes, and they've absorbed it. And that's come out of their own coffers. But I don't know that that would be the case here. Finally, after Board of Equalization hearings are done, an assessment ordinance is approved, and that assessment ordinance is the document that legally establishes special assessment on your property. That special assessment, we look at, I'll get up into that. You can also adopt a bond resolution authorizing the issuance and sale of municipal bonds to be sold in the marketplace. Once that assessment ordinance is approved, property owners have a 25-day prepayment period. If your assessment's $5,000 to be repaid over 20 years, and you would rather pay that off today and not accrue interest costs or financing costs, you can do that. You have 25 days to do that, and it could be paid in whole or in part. After that point in time, then you've lost that prerogative, and we'll talk about some of the other options. Let's look at the next slide. Assessment amounts. This is probably why a lot of us are here this morning. Determining the assessment amount, how much to allocate to each property owner, is an art rather than a science. It's very, it's intended to be driven to make those who benefit most pay the most. But determining benefit is very difficult to do. So in this case, keep in mind that we try to include all areas that have benefit from the improvements and nobody else. You don't benefit from a water tank, you cannot be assessed. You benefit from a water tank, you can be assessed, and then it's a matter of how we assess. What's the best method? Assessments need to be equal and uniform. That does not mean the same dollar amount, but the methodology has to be the same for everybody. We can't, in the legal documents, say that we're going to assess one person by front footage, someone else by assessed value, and someone else by acreage. Those are all legal methods of assessing property under the statute, but not something we can do in an assessment area unless there's some different benefit and we create separate zones. Some properties may carry a larger proportionate burden than others if they benefit more than others. As we indicated earlier, if your assessment's higher than your neighbors, it's because, at least in theory, you benefit more than your neighbors. It also means you have more say in whether the assessment area is created or not. Next slide. Once the assessment method has been done, we've done the resolution authorizing the notice of Board of Equalization. That's sent out. We've already said that the Board of Equalization will sit for 3 consecutive days. You'll be noticed 20 to 35 days in advance of these Board of Equalization hearings. We talked about the changes, kind of the expense to the issuer, where the governmental entity who's selling bonds, and the concession ordinance gets adopted. It's published once. We talked about the 25-day prepayment period, and here's where I want to make a very clear point about these special assessments. This is like a tax, like a property tax. It's not called a property tax, it's called a special assessment. But it is on parity with property tax liens, which is really important for you to understand, for your neighbors to understand, because if an assessment is not paid, you stand the chance of losing your property, having it foreclosed, like you would if you didn't pay property taxes. The distinction here is that under the Assessment Area Act, you don't have a 5-year grace period before foreclosure proceedings start, so like on a property tax delinquency. Under a special assessment lien, if you don't pay your assessment, your property can be foreclosed within 6 or 7 months. And so this is very critical for everyone to understand. It's a very strongly superior to everything else that's out there. It would supersede any other mortgages on your property or otherwise, and it's on parity with property taxes. So keep that in mind. Let's look at the next slide. When and if the assessment lien is established, that is collateral for bonds. The governmental entity sells the bonds in exchange for funds to build the public infrastructure, build water taking. Then takes special assessment payments annually from property owners to repay that debt. Because we don't know what the interest rate is on these bonds, we can't tell you how much interest you pay on top of the assessment. The assessment amount here is the total amount of principal that would come due on your property. Let's say it's $10,000. That $10,000 would be repaid over 20 years with interest. One gentleman talked to me earlier this week about what does this mean? You know, if my assessment's $10,000, I'm not just paying back $10,000. That's true. We're paying back probably around $16,000 of principal and whatever the interest cost is when that's noticed. We don't know what that is because the bonds haven't been sold and subject to all of the market forces. Yes, ma'am.
Is the percentage of interest based on the maintenance balance owed on the property, or is it based on the annual amount?
The interest is like it would be on a mortgage on the balance outstanding. So if your assessment's $10,000, you would pay the $10,000 plus the interest accruing on that balance. As you pay down your assessment from $10,000 to $5,000, the interest component also reduces. Generally, it's a fixed interest rate. It doesn't have to be. It could be variable. But generally, it's fixed, like you see on a traditional mortgage. Yes, ma'am. say that again?
Rate between 4.5 and 5. That's the suggestion.
I would say probably, yeah, I would think so. We know for other assessment areas that the going rate for raw ground is between 6 and 7%. Because this isn't entirely raw ground, and because Salt Lake County is involved, and because the coverage ratio, which is the value of land divided by the bond amount, is so strong, I think between 4.5 and 5 is a reasonable guess. But let me make you very well aware, that's just a guess. It will never, we won't actually know what it is until we get closer to the financing time. And that financing time is months away, months. To create an assessment area actually takes 6, 7, 8 months to go through the whole process. There's questions back here? We won't know, unfortunately. We can estimate, and that's really the best we can do. Between 4.5 and 5 is a pretty good estimate currently. Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, ma'am.
Would the assessment change for property as the value of that property changes? So let's say someone's assessed the current undeveloped property rate, and then that property is developed and now it's worth more. The assessment on that property change.
That's been a great question about if your assessment is set today, but then you develop that property and the value goes up, would your assessment amount go up commensurately? And the answer is no. Unfortunately, you set the assessments today based on what is existing today. You try to incorporate the what ifs as you're suggesting. Well, what if there's more development on these properties? Shouldn't they pay a little bit more because they're going to benefit more at some point in the future? So that's the science, that's the art between levying or allocating assessment costs. And we'll talk about that as we look at the assessment formula. But I think the intent has been, let's try to cover all the what ifs we can to the best of our ability today, but we never know what will happen. 20 years down the road, somebody may come in and say, well, I guess now is the time to develop my property now that everything's paid off and I've got a water tank and I can benefit from it. And there's nothing we can do about it at that point with the assessment. Now, there are other ways to help others pay their fair share through connection fees, for instance, as others connect on, that can be used, charged to someone after the fact. But they weren't part of that assessment area creation from the get-go. That's the trick. You're taking a snapshot in time and saying, here's the best we can do. Yeah. And the presentation will be posted on the NGOA website.
Yes.
I think that's fine. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Does, if you sell the house or property within that 20-year period, does that the remaining balance go on to the new owner then?
That's a good question. Yes. You've been assessed. The assessment lien is on your property. You sell the house within the 20-year period before it's fully paid off. Does it carry forward? The answer to that is it depends. Because a mortgage lender, for instance, should see once the lien is recorded on the title report, there's a special assessment. And it's like a property tax. Generally, with property taxes, and as you sell and buy your house, you have to pay off balances of property taxes before you actually close. Some lenders would require that same thing, that the assessment has to be paid off as part of the home sale or property sale. Others may, I'm not sure.
So it's considered like a lien?
It is a lien.
Oh, it is?
It is a lien, very, very strong, like the property tax. Others may say, well, I recognize it as a special assessment. I'm comfortable lending, knowing that it's there on the title report. Yes, sir.
So if you didn't pay it off initially within a certain length
The
of time,
25.
when you did sell your house and you be allowed to pay it off then to make the lender happy with the buyer?
That, yeah, you could, but let me caveat that with the last bullet here. Prepayment provisions when bonds are issued, when the financing is actually in place, are also market driven, like the interest rate. Some bond buyers will say, I do not want these bonds prepaid, period. What that means is that after that 25-day prepayment period is done, if someone 10 years into it wants to sell their home, prepay their assessment lien, or in whole or in part, the governing body who's collecting the assessment payments has to collect enough revenue to pay off the principal balance as well as any interest accrued through the prepayment date. This is complicated. So let's say that the bonds are sold and the buyer of those bonds says, no way, we will not allow prepayment. And a property owner wants to pay off their assessment or sell the land 10 years into the amortization. That means 10 years of additional interest expense has to be paid for by the property owner. You're locked out of any other prepayment, and so you'd likely say, well, I'm going to sell my house with this much more to cover the cost of the interest through the prepayment date. Now that's the worst case scenario. We don't see that pretty much at all. You know, usually bond buyers will want or expect a prepayment lockout for the first 10 years. That's more traditional. So if you try to pay off your assessment in year 5, you'd be responsible for the next 5 years of interest, which obviously costs you a little bit more. But it's ideal to try to find buyers who are willing to allow prepayment at any time. That provides property owners the most flexibility. If you want to pay off in year 3, if you want to pay off in year 17, you can do so. Your principal balance would be paid off to that point, plus any interest accrued from the last interest payment. And that's the ideal. But again, I put up here in the presentation, prepayment provisions are driven by the market. And sometimes what that means is, if you want a more flexible prepayment provision, you have a higher interest cost. If you want a lower interest cost, give up a prepayment option. It's just a balancing act there. I think next slide. We're about done with these. After the bonds are issued, the governmental entity is responsible for collecting assessments, paying off bonds, and releasing the liens on your property. They maintain accounting records so they know which property has which assessment outstanding, how much has been prepaid, how much is still outstanding, and how much what would the balance be if you wanted to prepay. This is the job of the governmental entity. They sometimes outsource it, but I think for the most part, Salt Lake County has their own internal assessment area administration. Yes, sir?
One more time. If I had a $10,000 assessment, right, and I say, okay, I'll pay $5,000 right now, then I can do half part of it, I don't have to pay the whole thing.
Correct. You can do that now within a 25-day prepayment period after the assessment ordinance is approved. That's correct. This is the job of the governmental entity. They're going to make sure that if there are delinquencies, that foreclosure proceedings begin. They're the ones who initiate those foreclosure proceedings. And they submit a bid at the foreclosure proceedings. So Salt Lake County would say, we will submit a bid. Nobody else bids. And if they don't want to, the state statute actually says, well, then we're going to turn the land over to the bondholders, and that's what the bondholders get, is your property. Benefits to the property owners, you have improved infrastructure. The risks to property owners, as we've already discussed, is the potential loss of property in a default if you miss your payment, and you do have to pay interest expense. If you prepay half or some or all of your assessment during that prepayment period, then you avoid the interest expense and you don't have a lien on your property. You're done. You paid your share. I think that's the extent of this assessment area presentation. Any questions on the assessment area presentation to this point? All right, let's look at the formula here for the calculation. We were told that the cost of pipeline improvements, water improvements, 1B, totaled about $2.5 million. There's a 10% contingency there. Engineering and management costs of around $200,000 for a total construction cost of around $2.9 million. Cost of issuing the bonds, which includes our fees, the bond attorney's fees, trustee fees, rating agency fees, if you sell in the market, end up being around $100,000. Then on top of that, there is what they call a debt service reserve fund. This is money that is used to buy time, if you will, in a delinquency situation. If there's a missed payment, this debt service reserve fund is tapped to pay bondholders, and the governmental entity goes through the foreclosure process and would take foreclosure proceeds to reimburse this reserve. So there's never a missed payment, if you will, from the bondholder side. Rounding amount just rounds it up. Generally speaking, you sell bonds in increments of 1,000 or 5,000. So there's usually a rounding amount in here. If we were to sell this bond, we've got total par amount here, $3,389,815. We would likely round up to $3,390,000.
I just had a quick question on that debt service reserve fund. If by chance we're lucky and that doesn't have to be used during that 20 years, is it reimbursed?
Great question. If the reserve fund is not used, what happens to it? It's used to make your last payment for you. So if your portion of that debt reserve is $500 and your last payment is $500, it'll be pulled out and used to make your last payment.
If you prepay, do you get a reimbursement, or you just?
If you prepay before you fully amortize, that portion of the debt service reserve would be factored into your prepayment amount, so it would be a little bit less. So it'd still be used to your benefit. Sometimes it has happened where it's not used in the prepayment, but it is reimbursed to you. Because you are responsible for the prepayment, you're responsible for the financing costs. This reserve is one of those financing costs that is yours to use.
On the off chance that it is reimbursed, that's the back of the property.
Goes back to the property owner.
So if we sell our house in 20 years, that owner gets their money.
If you sell your house and you don't prepay your assessment at the time, you're exactly right. It would stay with the property as opposed to the property owner, and would benefit the new property owner as opposed to you. Very good comment. Yes, ma'am.
So the contingency for construction, both sides, either don't use it or hospital.
When you do the final assessment ordinance, and before you actually set out your notice of the Board of Equalization hearings, you factored out all the costs. So if there's excess contingency in this budgeted amount that wasn't used because you've already filled the water tank and now you're smooth selling, you're only assessed on the actual cost of the improvements. So at that point, contingencies would be gone. Now, that raises another interesting point. Oftentimes, you create the assessment area and start the levying of assessments before the project's actually built to avoid interim financing costs and a bunch of other things like that. In that case, generally what we've suggested is that the par amount and the estimated assessment be higher than is really actually going to come about. If there is an estimated assessment that's higher than the actual costs, and you've started to impose that in advance, and costs come in lower, the governmental entity abates everybody's assessment at that point, says here, the assessment was 10,000. We didn't need all of that 10,000, so it's gone. The money doesn't go to the HOA for other things, it doesn't go to Harriman City, it goes to Salt Lake County. They use that as they administer to downsize everybody's assessment. But that again is only if you assess properties before the end of the construction process. Sometimes you, and it's sort of 50-50 at this point. It used to be that you do the construction, you get the bids, you would lock in the construction costs, and you go through, maybe do some construction financing, either funded by local investors or banks, or sometimes the governmental entity actually acts as its own bank, does the construction financing with its own dollars until that's all done and the assessments are made done. I don't know if there's been any discussion about which method would be used here, because I think we're so preliminary that we haven't really crossed that bridge. So that's good fun. Yes?
I have a question. Like mortgage insurance is tax deductible or mortgage interest? For your interest on your mortgage?
Right, mortgage interest is tax
Is
deductible.
the interest on this also tax deductible?
No. Yes, sir.
Well, this first assessment is for just one phase of the project.
Correct. If there were other phases that came on board, you'd have to create an assessment area with new projects, new costs, new allocations. Yeah, but right now it's just one tank. As this gentleman indicated earlier, it does not include other phases or other costs. Well,
Next year, or when this is done, there's going to be another assessment to continue the project.
there could be, if you so choose, as property owners, and that's what you want. Again, it's up to you whether you want to do that or not.
Does the 8 to 10 inch pipe, is that weak pipe in the entire association, or just the feed pipe to the tank?
I don't know the answer to that question.
It's just a tank.
Just to the tank. Yes, ma'am.
So there's an additional 220, no, 225 of the not, what else is there in the assessment, right? Is that correct?
220,
25 to 240 that should provide, potential for another 225 to 240, right?
there's potential for another 220, 245 homes,
Yep.
according to this. Okay.
So, but you're saying that's not in the calculation, those big homes, effects are not in your calculation.
Let's look at the bottom part of the worksheet here. I think either we want to address that one, about the additional 200 with some homes, it would be good.
Yeah, it's estimated with this tank, we could have another 225 to 240 homes. When they come on, they will pay a connection fee. That connection fee would be their portion of it. And most likely, that would be held by Harriman City and in an account for additional improvements in the future.
So when we pay down this bond,
What-
they wouldn't pay down the bond.
I don't believe it can pay down the bond. Did you answer that?
If you could,
Oh,
if you wanted to.
okay, so if we have the option to do that, and save the connection fees, each connection paid $10,000, that we would have a lump of money to pay it down early.
I guess it depends on what the basis of the connection fee is. Is the connection fee going to pay off their portion of this tank, or is the connection fee their portion of some other improvements that would need to be done in the future? If the latter is the case, then it wouldn't be available to pay down this bond. But if these are benefits of the tank, the answer is yes. Yes, sir.
So the main benefit of this tank is to allow for 240 more buildings. Why isn't the assessment like 95% towards that 240, and only 5 towards the rest.
Let's look at the application and talk about that. And that's a great lead in. The assessment calculation, 3.389 million is the total assessment by zone. Zone 1 consists of, as I understand it, areas A, B, and C. Zone 2 is D. What I understood, Zone 2 has a moratorium. And based on that rationale, they're only paying 5% of the benefit of the 5% of the cost of the tank, whereas 95% goes to zones A, B, and C, areas A, B, and C.
What are the benefits to zone D, area D?
What are the benefits to area D? I don't know. Can you answer that?
Area D, currently the capacity of the tank up there exceeds the demands for Area D right now. Water from that tank is taken down to serve the rest of the area. If the rest of the association had another water source or another storage, more storage capacity, then that wouldn't put as much pressure on the tank in Area D. And there could be a few more of those 240 houses. Some of them could be up in Area D until the well up there meets its capacity. That's the limiting factor right now. The water up there could serve a certain number more of houses in Area D. But once they've met that, then they need to do some improvements to bring more water up there.
Do you know roughly how many?
The master plan has the figure. I don't remember what it is. I don't know, Tom, if you know it. Okay, 100 more homes that well can serve. And the lower area, the rest of my country continues to buy water from Harriman, and that's what we have an agreement with Harriman. They continue to provide water. I think I heard your question right. Some of the water that's brought from that upper well, certain times of the year, is used by people in the lower area, up to the capacity of the well.
In the wintertime, we switch valves, and we actually, because there's less demand on the system in the wintertime, people aren't watering their lawns, as much as frequently, obviously. So what we do is we feed area C water from area D. But in the summertime, we close that valve, and then the tank up there serves only area D.
And in the summertime, area C gets their water directly from
From Harriman.
So at no point in time will area C be using this new tank.
Yes, we will.
We will be using it in the winter.
Not in the wintertime. Well, we could. They could. It depends how we manage the water system at that time. That's why area D is not getting assessed as much.
No, I think area C.
Yeah, we will still be getting the water from here. Even in fact, I think at this time they're actually blending the water.
But we're only, area C is only using the tank 50% of the time. Is that correct?
The tank in area D.
Well, this tank.
The new tank.
Yeah, this tank. To be quite frank, the tank will probably drive more benefit to area A and D than it is going to be providing to area C.
So why only one zone for all?
Because we are going to receive some benefit from that tank in area B.
Right. But why didn't we create
I can't subjectively tell you how much that would be, but we are going to receive some benefit because there'll be less demand on the whole overall system, because we'll have a bigger tank feeding area A and area B.
Well, I understand that, and possibly a lot of your concern is the other 6 items that are on this list. $10,000 is okay, but not $10,000 next year or in 2 years. Another $10,000,
Right.
another 2 years. That's not okay. And if D is
upgrade their tank, and upgrade their piping system up there as well. So eventually, this is gonna catch up with their need. There'll have to be another assessment somewhere down the line, looking out towards the future, that will have to address those problems for Area D as well. So there's nobody that's gonna get an unfair advantage over time, because the water system itself has to be replaced, the entire water system.
And that can be written.
No, I can't.
We don't all know our neighbors, and that's.
Yeah, it's gonna depend on board to board, how they address
Yeah,
the need.
I think that's, so maybe it should be spread evenly, and then when we have their issues, we don't, it's too hot. Of the 7 pieces of the plan, divide it evenly, because we like each other, the neighbors.
This is the hard part. This is the hard part about the assessment area, is trying to make sure that the benefits and the costs are balanced. Those who benefit most pay more. Very tricky to do, because from everybody's perspective, there's a different story. Yes, sir.
So my main concern with this is it looks like you guys have chosen a very simple way to do the assessment, 2 zones, where this is a very complex issue. To me, the zones need to be thought out way more than this. I mean, there's maybe 50 different zones would make more sense than 2. So who came up with the 2 zones? Is that science or is that the county?
Not actually sure who came up with that. I think it was part of the.
Sorry, the question, who figured this?
Yeah, I think
they came up with a plan for 2 zones.
I think this is the HOA's attempt to do the arts and science together, but it's not the county making any decisions on your behalf. Remember, we're here to help if you choose to go forward. Now, if you think the methodology is Jonathan,
If you think the methodology needs to be adjusted, modified, changed, whatever, that's exactly why we're having this meeting. Okay? The central question that we want to hear back from you is, yes, we want further conversation about this, or we're not interested. If you want further conversation, that's what we're going to want to know.
So maybe is there someone here that can speak towards why a simple 2-zone solution was chosen?
probably because we had to put something out for you to respond to see if you had an appetite for moving forward.
A lot of the basis, as I recall, the law firm Chapman and Cutler, as I understand it, was very instrumental in allocation, at least signing off that this was a fair, equitable and methodology. But I think a lot of it stems from engineering reports that show who's going to benefit from this water, not necessarily the tank. You know, the tank itself helps the system in general. So having a tank in one place could allow excess benefit to someone else with other resources or other infrastructures over here. But the idea is who's really going to benefit right now and how can we best capture all of this. The question was made earlier about all the future growth that's going to come on board and how do they pay their share versus residents who are currently there, living in the HOA, who have a house, and already paid for a lot of infrastructure today. After we divided it into 2 parts, we also divided it out by numbers of ERUs, or equivalent residential units, and value. Value is sort of a proxy of who's got a home on the property right now, because home values are higher than raw ground. So those who have homes on their property right now are covering about 25% of the cost of the improvements, whereas those who have a lot of space and potential to develop, therefore increased numbers of equivalent residential units, paying 75% of the cost. Again, this is not science, but it's trying to gauge what's a reasonable amount. Again, reasonable is the key, a reasonable allocation of costs based on what's currently here and what could be in the future. Try to gauge those differences.
I just wanted to reiterate what you started on, is that the water system is a system, right? Everything's connected, and there's a chain reaction. When you upgrade one portion of the system, it ends up upgrading the other parts as well. So even though if you were in a spot where your water inside your pipe may not come specifically from this new tank that we're building, it doesn't matter, because by building this tank, all of a sudden you have more capacity for fire protection and more capacity for sprinklers, and maybe for, you know, if you own raw land, for building a house that you wouldn't have had by building this tank. So really it benefits everybody. And in particular, the lower areas, so areas A, B, and C, those areas are very well connected, and so the benefits are transferred pretty equally. Up in area D, it's almost a different system. And while yes, they will see some benefit because we're alleviating the draw that we currently have on their tank, and so now they do have the opportunity for future build out, the benefit that they'll see from the construction of this tank isn't quite as equal as what we'll see in the lower areas. And so that's why, to me, the two-zone approach actually does make sense, because it is kind of two separate systems. They're slightly related, but it's a little bit different story there.
Zone 2 makes sense from what you're saying, but Zone 1 is not equal. I mean, especially between those that have houses and those that don't.
Yeah, so that's a little bit different debate, right? Do those who have houses and don't. But would you not agree that by upgrading anything in that lower area, you end up upgrading essentially the whole area, A, B, and C?
I think that there's some fine details in there that say yes or no is kind of very general.
Let's come over here with a question. Comment. She's saying that the 75-25 maybe isn't the best allocation, because those who have homes on their property also own land around their home and are being dinged for the extra ERUs that could potentially be built on that, and maybe shouldn't.
So in other words, residents are paying more for this assessment. Residents are paying more.
So because of that, because you've got a home and land around it, you're paying more than someone who just has the land. Is that what you're saying? That the sharing allocation may not be done correct. Let's see, ma'am, you have your hand up.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of questions around how the zones were set up. And for me personally, I would like to know who, whether it was the board or what group set up the zones, so we can have further discussion on that. I think that's
appropriate to have further discussion on how the zones were set up, and if there's a different idea. I know the engineering study was the driver for a lot of that allocation. Homeowners Association, for Zions Bank, Chapman and Cutler all reviewed that, weighed in on it to an extent. And I think that's probably
But who set it up? I mean, there had to be some body. We're skirting the issue. There were a lot of approvals and reviews in that, and I understand that. But what body? Who set up the zones?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Arlene, do you?
It was a combination of, I met with Zions Bank and Chapman and Richards, the attorneys, I'm sorry, and the engineer. And the attorney's interpretation of the engineer's study came back with this 5% 95% grade. We did look at some different options with a higher percentage in Area D. I don't think, again, it's an art. I think we could go back and relook at that. Where Tom mentioned Area C benefits a little bit differently. We didn't consider a third zone. It may be worth discussing again. Again, it's not set in concrete. We had to come up with something that made sense with this first draft. Well, and I could be the point. I have no problem with being the contact point with different thoughts. I'd be glad to go back and sit down with the group and say, hey, this is the input we're getting from our members now. Again, we were working with them without the input. We had to have some starting point. So, again, it's open for that still. Yeah.
Question is, if the current law says you cannot use or build or do anything with this thing other than leave this ground fallow, can you assess them at all? How can you assess anything to this parcel of ground that's left fallow?
And that relates to the question I have. So much of the area is under FCOS, and you can't build, and you won't have any benefit for the water.
Okay, where the number of URUs came, it's been 4 or 5 years ago, we hired an engineer to give us the number of buildable lots in high country. And the way they did it, it was very simplistic, is they took the entire area, they said, first, what's the number of 2.5 acre lots? Then they took an overlay with the hillside, with the areas that were on the hillside. They subtracted that out, and then they looked at the source protection area, subtracted that. That's how they came up with 695 units. That's what we base our water master plan on, and the sales of our water rights to Harriman. So that, and I don't know if you were here at the meeting, it's been probably 2 or 3 years ago, when we had the engineer come and present that whole rationale. Now, there were some people that said, well, there's more buildable units. We're gonna someday annex the Harriman and get smaller zoning. But that hasn't happened, and there's no promise that if we did annex the Harriman, we'd get smaller zoning. So we had 2.5 lots.
Can we find out if our lot's buildable? Say you identify the ones that are. Can we find out as far as it is?
Yes.
You can honor that.
If you can. And I look at the lots they allocated for my lots. I don't agree with it. I couldn't get that many units on my lots either. And there's other things in FCOS besides just that hillside that limits the buildability. And looking at that small detail in each lot, I mean, you can't, if the board came to you and said you only have one buildable lot, or we hired an engineer and said that, you wouldn't accept that. You would rather say, I'll hire my own engineer and argue with the county to get my lot. So that hasn't been done. I mean, that's impractical for us to do that.
I'm willing to pay my share, but if I can never build on the property, I will have no benefit from the water. But if I can build on it, and I can get some assurance that I can build on it, fine, I'm willing to pay my share.
And there are some lots that this study has shown there's no building.
How can I find out if I can build on it without going through an expensive building permit process? Is there a way to find out?
I think it's always been my feeling that that's the only way to find out.
So can we take it like a step back from there? Because his point's really valid, but if you take it back a step, that the SOMAS engineering study did say that there was a whole bunch more lots that are buildable than there really probably is realistically, because of not only FCOS, but a lot of the plots and lots that are up in high country are not subdivided. People think they are, but they aren't. And the subdividing process is separate from FCOS, depending on which planner you get at the county, you may or may not be able to do it together at the same time. But we just did this 2 years ago. It took us to go through both the subdividing and the FCOS process, $25,000, just under that. And I am not exaggerating. We can you have to count your plans, we have to get our building permit. It took us almost 2 years and just under $25,000. So realistically, and our lot only have one place that was buildable because of the steepness factor, which is part of the subdividing actually, more than FDOT. So that study though didn't take into account necessarily all those factors. You just said that. To account the hillside. So why are we building such a large tank? You know, everybody's concerned about the zones and how the fairness in that, but I think we should go back and look at it a step further because we're building this large of a tank because SOMA's indicated that that's what we need for this much of a build out, and if the build out is not realistically possible, why are we building such a big tank?
The cost of the tank is a small portion of this whole thing. The major cost is the piping to get up to the tank and the pumping the water. So even if we cut the tank in half, it'd probably save maybe $200,000, maybe not that much. So but the other reality, what you're saying is we could put this tank in and it could be years and years and years before we have the 200 extra lots. And by that time, they could be built out and they'd be helping finance something else, or we may never need to. We may be replacing tanks by that time. We don't know. It's been, in the last 5 years, I think there's only been 2 or 3 building permits on the market. Yes, the septic moratorium is still in place. We don't know when it would be removed.
Part of that, you gotta remember, part of the reason we're putting this tank in is because we don't meet fire code.
Yeah, and I think that's a valid point. Fire code area.
If you've lived up there through 2 fires, you realize that, and that's kind of goes to what Jack Darton said. The tank will, the firefighting, however we have to fire up here, that tank will provide additional protection whether you live in area A, B, or C, because depending on where the fire goes, it puts a demand on the system to draw water. Part of the reason we have to do this, part of the requirements of the board is the health and safety of this community. So basically, when the study came out, it said, hey, you don't meet fire capacity. Our piping doesn't meet. The piping that we have in the system, by today's standards, does not meet fire capacity.
But this assessment does nothing for the piping.
No. It's only the first phase.
So, and you know, what's the alternative? What's an alternative way to solve that problem?
We'll have to do another assessment with that pipe.
We've known about this for a while, right? Recently for a while. So, what reserves the homeowners association? What portion is
Well, we have an agreement with Harriman that they operate our water system plus capitalize our system. So in doing that agreement, the first thing Harriman did was try to find some funding sources for this. And they're calculating the water usage rates, the connection rates, all of that is based on this. That responsibility we transferred to Harriman City. Well, us as an association, we collect assessments for everything except water. That has been transferred to Harriman. We have separated our water usage fees, our water system cost in a whole separate budget. Once Harriman took over, that responsibility was transferred to them. And we will be talking about that a little bit this afternoon on their using water rates to help on some of these upgrade projects.
The way we can do it is by increasing your water rate. That's how we're going to have to do it.
But, so that they're in charge of our
We own the system and Harriman operates it. And if you want to see a copy of the agreement, it may be on our website. If it's not, I'd be glad to get your copy. Yeah.
So I'm a little confused. When I read this, it sounded to me like the repair of the tank has already been planned, paid for, has nothing to do with this new assessment.
Oh, the repair of the existing tank, we're replacing the existing tank in area A.
Yeah.
And that's being paid for by the water rights, that.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
Also,
that's
I was thinking
separate.
that here, this was also repair. So the repair is a whole other issue, and it's already been paid for?
Yes.
Okay.
This
So this is just a brand new tank
Yes.
for new property owners?
Yeah, there's two tanks, when we say area A tank and area B tank,
It's not just for the property owners, it's also for the health and safety of the community as it is today, being firefighting capacity.
Right, but, all right, so here's the balance. If this new tank allows for 240 new homes, our fire hazard is gonna go up. It's gonna go up a lot more than if we don't ever allow another 240 homes up.
That's not true.
Because the last fire was caused by a person. The one before that by a machine gun. I mean, so you get more people up here, you're gonna have more hazard on fire.
Depends how the fire starts.
Yeah, that's good.
Fire can start from a natural cause.
Yeah, we have one of those. We got it.
The association made the deal with air government so that the state didn't give their water right away, but that's because there's a time limit on that deal. If you don't use it, you lose.
You're exactly right, yes. We had water rights that exceed what we use. The state has the right to take those, we don't use them. At Harriman City, being a city, if they lease them from us, we could keep them. And we sold some to them.
That was the initial reason why the association and Harriman made the deal, is so they didn't end up out, cold out of the water.
That's right, exactly right. Yeah.
The Fairfield City is benefited as well, and there will be a drop of water on those leases going up for Fairfield City, so that we exist for water.
I know that Harriman doesn't benefit from this. I mean, they bought water rights from us, and they have a contract to operate our system. The money that they collect from water usage fees covers their costs.
Is that set for so many years, or are we able to get the rates?
They,
More money for the fund, so that we can more development, we'll be able to raise the lease, or we able to
they calculate our usage rates, and they have, we're going to talk about their meeting this afternoon. They're proposing to up them by 5% to help on some contingency. Also, they calculate connection fees. So once we find out what's going to go on with this tank, they'll go back and revisit their whole connection fee calculation. And that money, they can keep in an account. Again, like we were talking about, if it was once the tank was built and we had a choice between using that to pay down the bond or having Harriman keep it in an account, that's something that we need to make that decision. We could request that they do that. Yeah. We will, it just depends how much time we will be doing, how long it will take to do that.
We didn't know, we didn't hear his question.
Pardon?
What was his question?
Oh, about the water master plan, do we have to address all of the points on the water master plan? And basically what they are, it's this Area B tank, they're building the new tank, replacing the Area A tank with a larger tank, putting in a larger tank up in Area D, and putting in a piping and a pumping station in Area D to get more water up there. And then replacing the undersized pipe and just other miscellaneous replacement and upgrades on the system. A lot of that other miscellaneous is being done now, upgrading fire hydrants, if there's a break in a pipe or any major problems, Harriman's upgrading it according to the current code in the master plan. What do you think?
From my perspective, I mean, this is something I think we desperately need. We need to invest in the water system. And clearly the hard part here is going to be how to fairly apportion the cost for each property owner. And that's the thing that needs to be addressed. I don't think we're very close to what it ought to be. The proposal based on 25%, 75% sounds good until you do the math. You end up with people with existing homes that have already funded the existing water system solely because we keep assessments completely separate from the cost of water systems. So the current water system is paid for 100% by those with water connections or prepaid water connections and the usage fees. Whereas those with undeveloped land have not contributed yet to the cost of the water system. So it seems like the cost should be higher for those who are going to have the bigger future benefit, as been said before. But more to the point, the 25-75% sounds good on the surface, but when you do the math, if you look at the difference in value of a property with a house on it to raw land, and you multiply it out, those with the existing house are paying twice as much towards this project as those with raw land. But they get more of the benefit. So even if you went to basing it on ERUs only, just flat ERU, that's your portions, then those with existing homes will still be paying more based on the tax contribution, but at least that would be closer, if I might be more equitable, and a bit simpler.
Pure ERU based.
Pardon?
Pure
ERU based. Those with existing homes will still, in my mind, be paying more than the benefit, but it'd be more equitable than the current proposal, where those with current properties based on valuation end up paying twice as much as undeveloped land.
Exactly explain once more, as the residential units, how that's figured. Is it figured upon whether there's a house, or how do you do the ERU?
If there's a house, you have one ERU. If you have one house on 2.5 acres, you have one ERU. If you have 5 acres and a house on it, you have one ERU where your house on is 2.5 acres and then a second one. So you have 2 ERUs.
And if you have undeveloped land, how is that assessed?
You would have, say if you have 10 acres of undeveloped land, you would have 4 ERUs. Unless the original study, we call it the Luce-Hansen study, showed the topography limited you. There's one lot here I'm aware of that's 30 acres, and it has totally 0 ERUs because it's all on hillside.
If you have gone through the subdivision process and 3 of your 10-acre lots are deemed not buildable by the county, can you be taken out of that assessment?
Okay, we use this Luce-Hansen study based on the attorneys that work for Zions Bank saying we needed a concrete engineering study. We couldn't go on individual scenarios. But say if you do have something from the county that says your land is undevelopable, then you go through that board appeal process.
I just also wanted to bring up in the letter, and I don't know the accurate amount right now, but it lists 171 current homes, and that's in what, 37 years? And we're worried about 240 being built. Do you realize how many have been built in the last 5 years, and the possibility of them being built in the future due to FCAUS, septic moratorium, all of these other things? So I kind of agree with her. Why are we worrying about 240 more homes or the cost to the people that live there, because they really are the only ones that are going to benefit. Everybody benefits. No, everybody doesn't benefit. If you can't utilize your land, you don't have a
So is this water system the only thing holding back the 240 that came in the letter?
No. No. It's the county. If you all would help us get the county to take FCOS off of our property, if you would band together and say, Harriman, get us out of the septic moratorium system, then all of us that would like to build could build, and we'd be happy to give you our support on the water tank, on improving the roads, and all the other infrastructure that you need.
Yeah, we don't want
To the comment
And you
here.
don't want another 240 homes, so then why are we paying for the people that live there?
This comment, there is some document from the state, the county, or otherwise that says you cannot build on your property. That would be helpful to know up front as well, because then you could say instead of 10 ERUs on your property or 4 ERUs, you only have one. Then from the get-go, we could allocate the costs a little more accurately. Well, the problem is that I don't know who knows that, and what trumps, is the county's letter saying you can't develop now going to be the end of the discussion, or will that change 5 years from now and you find for the maximum what ifs? I don't know. But it would probably be handy for everybody if they're aware that they're not going to be building three houses on their property for one reason or other. Maybe address it with you up front. So then as we proportion and allocate costs, we would have that data accurate from the get-go. But what I see happening later on is if you come in during the board of equalization, the costs have already been distributed to everybody else, and the county ends up eating some of the costs that maybe it shouldn't have to in the first place. But again, that's tricky. Like the Chapman Color guys are always relying on the engineering study. The engineers understand the water system better than the bankers, and they're basically able to say, to one degree or another, here's the allocation, here's who benefits most based upon the engineering, the pressures, the elevations, the storage, everything else. But I think it's helpful to get everyone's input and then take it to the engineers to try to evaluate that.
The engineers already gone through the whole high country too and decided how many lots they can put on the map according to the way that Putin Gudville was called engineering originally put the deal through, because at one time, 40 years ago, some guy flew over in an airplane and given a meeting from the University of Utah and said he needs 20 acres to build a house because it was basically useless grazing ground, and it'd take 20 to 50 acres to supply enough grass to feed one cow. There's been a lot of things that happened over the last 40 years because I've been there and seen it happen. Just like if you talk to anybody that knows anything about the sewer system, with the elevation and the grade and the rock, whoever bids on that deal when they go to put the sewer in up there, they better have a big deep pocket, or they're going to be broke in the first 30 days, because when they go to meet the payroll, they've already spent all their money on powder just to try to get a few holes in up there. That crap up there is harder than 80. So this is just a small problem here.
The sewer's
They were
bigger problem.
putting the top field and the sewer.
It'll be really expensive.
Yeah, when they start talking about dollar bills, when they go to the sewer, they better get bigger dollars.
Yes, ma'am.
I have an idea. I don't know if it would work, but would it be, one of the kind of the big bone of contention with everybody is having, with a lot of people, is having lots that may or may not be buildable according to the FCOS and the subdividing process. Would it be possible for Patrick maybe to talk to the planning commission of the county, and these people that have these lots, they don't know if they're buildable or not, could they maybe, instead of having to pay the thousands and thousands of dollars to go through FCOS and the subdividing, could they maybe do a smaller portion of that, like a slope analysis, let's say, where they're willing to maybe pay for the slope analysis because it would be part of their subdividing that they may need to do or may not, and have the county say, you know, yes, we would think this is subdivided or no. And then you have your letter, or then you have your proof to go to the board of equalization or whatever steps we are in at that point. I mean, would the county maybe consider only doing that portion instead of the whole FCOS or the whole subdividing process?
I think we did talk more about that. I'm not sure I'm fully understanding what your idea is, but it's very difficult. FCOS is an ordinance that's designed to look at what you're trying to build given the constraints that have been adopted by the county, obviously. So what it may be limiting today, based on today's technology, may not be limiting tomorrow. We see that all the time with changing technology. So to look at something and give you a letter saying today, based on what we know today, it's buildable and not buildable, may change tomorrow, right? And I think what, unfortunately, with this particular tool, the special assessment tool that is before you this morning, it looks at what is today, it's that snapshot in time today to apportion those costs. Trying to look at the future a little bit, but that future may change. So
we have to
it'd be
decide
very,
today.
very difficult.
But we have to decide today, so we have to take the snapshot. I mean, we need to know the information now. Is there a chance that I can build or not? If it's no, then I'm going to get no benefit. If it's yes, then I'm willing to help pay.
Well, that's why I said this.
I understand that. The question is, so you're asking me without context, right? So
But the whole thing is kind of without context. The whole thing is a snapshot right now. We have to make a decision now. We have to vote now. So all we can do is use the information we have now. It would be helpful.
So you don't have to make a decision now, and we're not asking for you to vote today. What I'm saying is, you're asking me a hypothetical question, can I build on my lot? What is it that you want to build? What are you proposing to build? What are your building plans? You know, those are the things that get analyzed, as you well know from your experience.
You have to remember, FCOS was not in place when these lots were sold. It was imposed later.
I understand that, and that causes a bone of contention. I get that. You also recognize that we put together a commission that was represented by individuals from this area that looked at the issue of whether or not FCOS should be removed from this area. And that blue ribbon panel concluded that FCOS should stay in this area. So that's the decision we're moving forward with. That's how the county is proceeding today. Yes, sir.
Well, I think there's a huge mismatch here. One, the engineering firm that we chose was a green firm. It's a new firm, new college graduates. They went with a gold-plated design. They chose the high end of everything, the high water consumption per lot. They didn't tailor it to our community, which encourages native growth and very little lawns. And so we end up with a $4 million system for what we paid in the past, $250,000 per tank. And so we've got that huge mismatch, and then we have this bulldozer process that's trying to extort the money from us. And you say we don't need to make a decision today, but given things will move forward, and it will go forward, and we'll have these assessments. This is probably the only time we gather as a group. So I make the suggestion to my neighbors that we reject this proposal today, right here, right now, because it puts too much of the burden on the people who will receive too little benefit, and the proposal, including the engineering, which we haven't been appraised of, is, I think, gold-plated and is overkill for what we need, for the rate of development that will go forward in the next couple decades that we want this to support. This is much bigger than is needed to support that development. We've always been a pay-as-you-go community, and why is the board unilaterally decided we're not going to be a pay-as-you-go community and a bootstrap community?
I just ask if everybody votes this down today again, if you have land that doesn't have a house on it, maintain your land. Knock down the leaves, knock down the trees, because somebody needs to not fire. And we need the water to do it. So maintain your land or have water to fight fire. Because we have lost the house. And it is important that we have water to fight fire.
We would love to cut down our trees. We are not allowed to cut down a tree under FCOS.
Well, I mean, clear off the brush off the bottom.
You can cut
Cut
down trees that are
the-
small, sadly. FCOS does allow that. You're supposed to clear those. I think it's 10 feet. You're supposed to keep it clear, or 6 feet. You're supposed to keep it clear. So just to clarify, FCOS does allow you to clear out.
Most of the people you're
the
putting
dead
is not
brush
done
and
with
the
tanks.
lower-
We take
the-
on.
That's what I'm saying, people have to maintain their property. Or have water behind it. You can't have the best of the
But I want to, I think when I come across here, I'm kind of coming across as being torn, which I am, because I have gone through the FCOS process and the subdividing very recently, and it was just horrible. And tears and blood was spilled. It's just horrible. So I'm sympathizing with these people that may or may not know that they can build. But I would not say, as your neighbor, to flat out vote against this. I think we all need more information because we do all need the fire protection. Your property will be absolutely worthless if it's been grazed by fire, over and over again. So I don't want to get the impression that I'm thinking that we should all say, no, we don't need this. We need the water system. And I disagree that we're being bulldozed. I do not think we're being bulldozed. That's why they're having this information meeting. I think that you need to also look at that. Remember that the people, you're saying that the people that are going to benefit the most are the homeowners, but that's not true because it's being assessed by ERU. Or no, you said,
The
no.
developers. This has current homeowners
But the
subsidizing
developers
future
can't build
developers.
these.
And that's what I don't like.
Patrick,
Do we have an engineering cost of what it costs us for upgrades to the fire system for existing homes versus additional, the benefits of, a bunch of new residents? Is there two separate costs?
So she's asking, is there an engineering analysis and cost estimate to get your existing water system up to fire code? I don't know.
The new replacement of the Area A water tank will bring, it's going to be a larger tank, so it will bring the area up to code and will allow them 25 to 40 houses. Area D, that tank up there gives you more than enough protection for fire as long as the other areas aren't using it. If there's a fire below, the tank's drained and they use to put out that fire. But overall, we will be code with.
So was the engineering study based on the desire to build more homes or the desire to get it up to code? In which
It was everything, the whole system.
So can we split it?
Yeah, they looked at the water pressure, for example, some areas, if you try to build a house, you don't have enough water pressure or flow, you can't get a building permit. If you put that tank in Area B where it's located, that would solve that problem. For a lot of people, it wouldn't Area D, but that tank would provide the storage, so your tank isn't used for other areas. So it's a whole system.
So are those
You
two
can't separate
issues
it.
inseparable?
They are, it's a whole system.
I have a question for Patrick. Several years ago, we paid for a slope analysis for the entire high country. I know that you can't do anything that would be definitive, but if you had that slope analysis, could you at least identify what you felt, nothing in writing, but what you felt the lots had as far as potential borders?
So, this may have been before my time, but did the county do the slope analysis? You've done the slope analysis.
We paid an engineer to do it.
So we would love to look at that, and given that information, have further conversation. Glad to.
Even further on that line of thought, maybe there are a whole set of FCOS requirements where you could say, yeah, these lots check all these boxes. I understand that there are other boxes that can't be checked until we know it's going in on the place. But it would be great if we could have some sort of indication as to how qualified each lot is.
And you get into some dangerous areas using some logic and common sense, so.
I know.
We can go down that road.
That's why I mentioned slope, because slope has not changed. slope that is allowed to be built on. That has not changed in the last 30 years. Yes, FCOS, hillside ordinances in place, and then FCOS, there's a lot of other things that have changed, but the slope. So when you talk about not knowing what's going to happen in the future, I mean, I know you can't give a definitive answer, but the slope, what they will allow us to build on, has not changed, so that would probably be something, maybe not definitive, but still a better art at figuring out what is buildable.
So we'd be glad to look at that. And if this gentleman's right and someone starts dynamiting things out here, that may change some slopes here and there, but let me get us back.
Out here, you gotta make your own.
Let me sort of move us along. I think one of the gentlemen raised the issue very early in today's meeting that the letter that was sent out was not accurate, right? We used the wrong term. And there are a lot of people who are not here today because they may live out of state or whatever. It's incumbent upon us to send out a corrected letter with the accurate information and allow everyone to have a chance to weigh in into the HOA debate, if you will. So we will be sending out a corrected letter to everyone again. And we will use that to sort of gauge the sentiment of the community of whether or not you want further conversation about this, more information, changes to the methodology that has been used, that kind of thing. Yes, sir.
Question, if you're going to send that change out, would it be realistic to put in the interest that is to be expected during the life of that bond and reflect a real true picture of what we're talking about?
Recent estimates.
Some estimated to add principal and interest over time.
This $72 was an estimate of interest and principal. This is only principal.
Just principal. That's correct.
So I think
principal of both.
yes, sir, we did it, knowing that it'll be an estimate, and it'll be clearly labeled as an estimate, we did do that. Yes, ma'am.
Do we go ahead and vote now, or are we going to vote with
not
the new
voting.
letter? No, I don't mean now. I mean with the letter, in reference to the letter we're talking about.
I think the letter actually has 3 options for you. If we're not interested, we want
Right.
more information, or yes, we would like to move forward. So wait for the corrected letter to come out and then make sure you send that back to us. At that point in time, I think we will definitely share, the results of the vote, if you will. And it's not a binding vote by any means, but really, as Jonathan said earlier, the special assessment is nothing more than a means to an end. It is one tool that could be used to help move this project along. If you don't want to use it, that's okay. To the gentleman's point over here, at some point in time, you're probably going to have to address these issues. How do you do that? May not be by this method at all. So, okay. Yeah, June 13th will be next Friday, right? Yeah, so we'll get a letter out the first of the week. We'll put a very big poll, corrected, amended, new, mostly accurate letter to be made on it. Yes, sir.
What year did this have, come into being? Whose idea was it? Because it didn't say pay and then coming back.
It was, I think, adopted originally in 1997. Whose idea was it? I'm not sure. Somebody who doesn't live in the state of Utah anymore. I understand that we just spent a lot of time and a lot of people looking at it, and I don't think the sentiment is there to rescind it because there is some value to it. But what we want to do is try to alleviate the headaches that go along. So, can't hear you.
Okay, if everything went beautiful and it was a yes, when mentally, if we wanted to get rid of the interest and pay up front, when are we going to have this money? We mentally need to know if it all goes yes, we got to be saving our little chestnut someplace so we can do it.
Well, as Jonathan explained, this is a real process, right? So even if you all said yes, there's still a political body, the county council, that would have to say, okay, we hear you, we're in favor of doing this, and they have to make that decision as well. I think Jonathan said that the process, the legal process is probably 6 to 8 months, maybe, to get out everything aligned. So I think we're a ways away from that.
Probably a year or so. Probably a year.
A year or so?
Yeah, if you were to start the process right now, and depending on whether you concluded with the issuance of bonds and assessed properties before the tank was actually built or not, which I don't know the answer to that, what the timing might look like. But it takes about 8 months to go through the whole process of creating the assessment area. Another probably 6 to 8 months to a year to build the tank. I'm not an engineer, so I don't know exactly how long it takes to build a tank, but I think it's less than a year, probably about 8 months. So you could have 16 months there before your assessment's due, or closer to 8 to 9 months. Again, from the green light, let's start the process. You know, that may not happen next week, might not happen until next year. Whatever the county council says and has sort of the direction from the homeowners association that that's the plan and that's the direction we want to take, then you could start that time clock ticking.
I think if that was the process, I think the HOA would probably want a calendar of events so that you'd be well aware of the timing of everything. Any other questions, final comments? Yes, sir.
The amount based on actual contractor estimates and cost of the engineer's estimate of what they think it's going to take. We don't have to do this process at all.
Engineer's estimate. So the bidding process would take place, I think, pretty late in the game after you all made your decision.
So the actual amount lowered by quite a bit will all be reimbursed.
I think Jonathan addressed this earlier. The cost, if the project comes in under budget, then I think that goes through an abatement process for you.
Correct. You can only be assessed for actual costs unless, again, you adopt the assessment ordinance prior to the construction completion, and then the county runs the risk in that case that if their cost overruns, they've got to pay for it. If their cost underruns, then it's just rebated back to the property owners.
I'm kind of curious about what the build-outability of my acreage. Because if there isn't any value there, if it's too deep, you can't build on it. And maybe I should just go on the side and try to pedal it, even the whole deal, and move away and go fishing somewhere. I mean, it is. I've been fighting this deal for 41 years. I just got to the point where I stopped breaking the truck on the kidder every fly. I feel like I started my own egg flat when I got the association started and drilled the first hole in the ground, brought the power up from Airman. I mean, if I'd have known 41 years ago what I know today, I just went down to Walker Bank and I'd have borrowed the money and I'd have done the whole thing, me and electric company. And then when the next guy wanted to hook on and he could put the money back in my pocket, I could just go on to my next project. Instead of getting 9 other people to go in on it with me and then get the paperwork that Evan Dahl wrote out and got the association started, so I got 9 other people to help me get it started, and it's been a continual bowl of money.
Okay, though, we gotta go home and have lunch.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to thank Rick and Jonathan for taking time on this Saturday to share this information with us. And, we have less than an hour to come.
You need a break. Yeah. So any final thoughts? We're glad to come out again and talk to you more, so we'll get that revised letter out to you. Have a good lunch. Thank you for being here this morning. Good luck this afternoon.